The millionaire CEO thought he'd left her behind, until he saw her holding a little boy with his eyes. Andrew Carter could still remember every detail of the day he decided to walk away from Rachel. The memory had never really left him, no matter how many times he told himself it had been the right thing to do. He remembered the way the late afternoon light had slanted across her small apartment, turning the faded curtains into panels of dusty gold. He had stood there in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, feeling like he was doing something necessary, something almost noble in its harshness. He told himself she had never loved him for who he was, only for what he could give her. He convinced himself that every gift, every shared moment, had been part of a transaction he had never agreed to. When he said the words, when he told her that she would get nothing more from him, not the money, not the gifts, not even a polite goodbye, she didn't cry. She had only looked at him with that calm, level gaze that had always unsettled him far more than any accusation could have. He realized, even then, that part of him had been hoping she would beg, because if she did, he could feel justified in his anger. But she hadn't. She had simply lifted her chin and asked in a voice that didn't shake whether he was sure. He remembered the quiet finality of her question, how it landed in the space between them like the closing of a door that would never open again. He had nodded because he believed it was the only way to protect himself. He had spent too many years believing that love was a weakness he couldn't afford. When he left, he didn't look back. He made it as far as the elevator before something cold settled in his chest, but even then, he ignored it. By the time he reached the street, he had already started rehearsing the version of the story he would tell himself later, that she had used him, that he had no reason to feel guilty. He told that story so many times that eventually he almost believed it. He didn't think about how small she had looked sitting on the edge of her sofa or how carefully she had folded her hands in her lap so he wouldn't see them tremble. He buried those images under meetings and acquisitions, under headlines praising his discipline and focus. If anyone asked about her, he simply said they had parted ways because it hadn't been right. No one ever pressed further. But late at night, when the world was quiet and there was nothing left to distract him, he sometimes found himself thinking about the way she had watched him as he walked out the door. Not with anger. Not even with disappointment. Just a tired, unflinching sadness that seemed to echo long after he was gone. And in those moments, when he lay awake in the dark, he wondered if he had walked away from the only thing in his life that had ever been real. In the 3 years that followed, Andrew built a life so structured that no unpredictable feeling could break through it. He doubled the size of his holdings, launched 2 new companies, and bought a penthouse overlooking the river where the city lights glittered all night. He traveled constantly, never spending more than a few weeks in one place, because motion felt safer than stillness. If he stayed still too long, he risked remembering the look in Rachel's eyes when he left her with nothing. He learned to occupy every moment with something productive, a meeting or a negotiation or a carefully managed dinner with investors. When he was alone in a hotel room, he would open his laptop and check earnings reports until his vision blurred. Anything to keep the memory at bay. At first, he expected her to call. He thought there would be messages, perhaps some attempt to reclaim what he had taken, or at least to ask why. But the weeks passed in silence, and her absence grew heavier than any accusation. That silence was the one thing he had never prepared for. He would have known how to respond to anger, even to pleading. But she had simply disappeared from his life, and in some twisted way, it made him angrier than if she had fought. He convinced himself that proved he had been right, that she had never cared. When he heard from mutual acquaintances that she had moved to a smaller neighborhood across town, he told himself he didn't care where she went. He told himself it didn't matter. But some nights, when his reflection in the dark window looked older than he remembered, he caught himself wondering whether she was all right. Whether she had someone to help her. Whether she ever thought of him. He would stand there, hands in his pockets, watching the city below and feeling a hollow ache he never admitted out loud. In meetings, he was the same man he had always been, sharp, focused, unbending. No one ever saw the part of him that lay awake at 3 in the morning, replaying that final conversation word for word. People often told him how enviable his life was. The power, the influence, the ease with which he could have whatever he wanted. They said it as though it were obvious that he had one. He never corrected them. He let them believe he had no regrets. He almost convinced himself it was true. But in the quiet hours before dawn, he knew that every success he added to his empire was just another layer over something broken. He wondered how long he would be able to pretend he didn't feel it. He wondered if there would ever be a day when he could finally let go of the question he had never dared to ask: what if he had been wrong? The morning everything began to change started like any other. Andrew was on his way to a board meeting across town, reviewing projections on his tablet while his driver wove through traffic. He had barely slept the night before, but he told himself he functioned best on discipline alone, that rest was an indulgence for people who couldn't bear to keep moving. The car slowed near a small cafe he barely noticed most days, a corner storefront with cracked window frames and faded awnings. He hadn't planned to stop, but something made him glance up from his screen. Maybe it was instinct or habit, or maybe it was the same part of him that never really let go of the past, no matter how hard he tried. He told the driver to pull over and wait. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold morning air bit through his overcoat, making him feel abruptly, uncomfortably awake. He stood there for a moment, trying to understand why his chest felt tight. When he turned toward the cafe window, he saw her. Rachel was sitting on the bench outside with her head bent slightly, her hair pulled back in a loose knot that didn't quite hide how tired she looked. But it wasn't just her presence that made him forget how to breathe. Next to her sat a little boy, no more than 3, his small hands gripping the edge of the bench as he swung his feet back and forth. The boy lifted his face at the sound of Andrew's steps, and the force of recognition hit him so hard he actually swayed. The child had his eyes. The same clear blue, impossible to mistake. The boy tilted his head curiously, blinking up at him with an expression Andrew had seen in the mirror every day of his life. For an instant, the world narrowed to that single point of connection, as though nothing else around them existed. He felt his heart slam against his ribs, a cold shock of certainty that drowned every rational explanation. Rachel looked up then, as if she had sensed him before she truly saw him. Their eyes met, and time did something strange, folding in on itself so he felt like he was standing again in that small apartment 3 years ago, about to say the words he would regret for the rest of his life. But this time, there was no anger or accusation in her face. Just a tired wariness and something else, something that looked too much like resignation. She shifted slightly, as though to shield the boy with her body, and Andrew felt a hollow shame settle under his skin. He took a step closer before he could decide if it was wise. His voice sounded rough when he spoke, and he hated that he couldn't make it steady. Rachel. The name tasted unfamiliar, though he had thought it 1,000 times in the dark. She didn't respond immediately. She just watched him with that same unreadable expression. He tried again, feeling the words scrape out of him. Is he mine? For a long moment she didn't answer. The boy looked from one of them to the other, his gaze bright with a curiosity he was too young to hide. Finally, Rachel nodded. Her hand came to rest gently on the child's back, her fingers curling in the fabric of his jacket. His name is Liam, she said. Her voice was low and calm in a way that made it worse, because he knew she had rehearsed this moment in her mind over and over. He's your son. Andrew swallowed, but it did nothing to clear the tightness in his throat. He tried to find something to say, some question that would make this moment feel less surreal, but all he could think was that he had missed everything, his first steps, his first words, the way he must have smiled when he recognized the person he loved most. He looked down at Liam, at the small hands and the familiar eyes, and felt something inside him break in two. Rachel shifted again, adjusting her hold on the boy's shoulder. You don't have to pretend, she said, softer now. I didn't ask you for anything. I'm not asking you now. But he shook his head, because the idea that she thought he might walk away again felt unbearable. I'm not pretending, he managed. He looked back at the child who was his, who had never known him, and he felt the first raw edges of a regret so complete it almost took his breath away. "I didn't know," he whispered, though he knew it didn't matter. He hadn't been there to find out. Rachel looked down at Liam, smoothing his hair with a tenderness that made Andrew's chest ache. She didn't say another word. She didn't have to. He understood in that moment that nothing in his life had ever really been about success or ambition or the need to stay in control. All of it, every decision he had made, had led him to this sidewalk, staring at the proof of what he had lost. And no amount of discipline or money or pride would ever make him whole again. He didn't know how long he stood there in front of Rachel and Liam, but it was long enough for the morning chill to seep into his bones. People moved around them on the sidewalk, some glancing curiously at the strange tableau of a suited man staring at a woman and a child with an expression too raw to hide. He had faced boardrooms full of adversaries without flinching, had negotiated contracts worth millions without losing his composure, but standing in front of them now, he felt stripped of every defense he had ever built. He tried to speak again, but his voice failed him, so he simply gestured to the empty space beside Rachel on the bench. She hesitated, her shoulders tensing, as if she was preparing herself to be disappointed again. He felt the weight of that unspoken fear settle heavily between them, a silent record of every choice he had made to prove he didn't care. When she finally nodded, he sat down slowly, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. Up close, he could see how tired she looked, the faint hollows under her eyes and the delicate lines that hadn't been there the last time he had seen her. But she was still beautiful, in a way that made something twist painfully in his chest. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Liam shifted restlessly, turning to bury his face against Rachel's arm. She smoothed a hand over his hair and glanced at Andrew without meeting his eyes. He didn't know how to begin. Every phrase he rehearsed sounded either too formal or too shallow, as though words alone could somehow bridge the distance of 3 years and all the damage he had caused. In the end, the only thing he could manage was the truth, as bare as it felt to say it. "I didn't know he existed," he said quietly. "If I had known," he stopped because he wasn't sure what he would have done. He wanted to believe he would have come back, that he wouldn't have let pride decide everything, but he couldn't be certain. That uncertainty felt like its own kind of shame. Rachel's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time he saw something flicker there, a fragile echo of the woman who used to believe he could be more than he was. But her voice was calm when she answered. "I know you didn't know. But you also never asked." She looked back down at Liam, her fingers tracing a little circle on the boy's shoulder. "You made it very clear you didn't want anything from me." He winced, because it was true. He had built that wall between them, brick by careful brick, convinced he was protecting himself. All he had really done was protect his fear. The fear of being needed, of failing someone who depended on him, of not being enough. Liam shifted again, peeking up at him with solemn blue eyes that made Andrew feel like he was being seen for exactly what he was. Not a success. Not a figure of power. Just a man who had run away from the one thing that could have made his life real. He forced himself to meet that gaze, even though it felt like the hardest thing he had ever done. He turned back to Rachel and found that his hands were trembling slightly in his lap. He folded them together so she wouldn't see. "I'm not here to demand anything," he said finally. I'd like to know him. If you'll let me." The silence that followed felt longer than any boardroom negotiation he had ever endured. Rachel's eyes searched his face, as if she was looking for the first sign that he would break his word again. He didn't blame her. He had given her every reason to doubt him. But eventually she looked back down at Liam and smoothed his hair again. Her shoulders relaxed by a fraction, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "I don't know what that will look like," she said. "I can't promise anything." "I understand," he whispered, because he did. He didn't deserve promises. He didn't deserve her trust. But maybe, if he was careful, if he showed up every day and proved he could be more than the man he had been, he could earn the smallest place in this child's life. They sat there a little longer, the three of them in a hesitant, uneasy circle, while the rest of the city moved on as if nothing monumental had happened. To anyone passing by, it probably looked like a family out for coffee on a cold morning. To him, it felt like the first fragile moment of something that might one day heal the empty space he had carried inside him for years. Andrew didn't know what he expected when he finally stood and asked if he could walk them home. Maybe he thought Rachel would say no and gather Liam in her arms and disappear back into the quiet, hidden life she had built without him. But she surprised him by hesitating only a moment before she nodded. Her agreement felt fragile, as though any wrong word might shatter it, and he treated the moment like something precious he didn't dare mishandle. They walked slowly down the block, past shops he had never noticed, because he had never needed to look. The morning traffic hummed around them, but all he could hear was the small, steady sound of Liam's feet as he shuffled along beside his mother, clutching her hand with one small fist. Every few steps, Liam glanced up at him with wide blue eyes, studying him as though trying to puzzle out what role this stranger played in his quiet world. Andrew wished he had the right to take his hand, to lift him up the way he had seen other fathers do, but he knew he hadn't earned that yet. So he kept his distance, matching their pace without imposing. Occasionally he asked Liam a question, how old he was, whether he liked the park down the street, and though the boy never answered, he watched Andrew with cautious curiosity, and somehow that felt like a beginning. Rachel remained silent through most of the walk, her posture straight and her chin lifted, as though she needed every ounce of composure just to share the sidewalk with him. Once, when Liam tugged her sleeve to ask for a snack, she knelt to rummage through her bag, and Andrew saw the fraying seam near the zipper, the faint wear in the knees of her jeans. The sight made his throat tighten with guilt he couldn't disguise. He thought of all the nights he had spent in hotels that cost more for a week than she likely earned in months. All the time he had pretended she didn't exist so he wouldn't have to face what he had done. When they reached the small brick building where she lived, she paused in front of the door, turning to face him. For a moment, she looked like she might tell him to leave after all, that it was too late for him to try to be part of any of this. He felt his pulse thud against his ribs as he waited for her judgment. But instead, she rested her hand lightly on Liam's shoulder and spoke without looking at him. "I don't want to confuse him," she said quietly. "I don't know what you want from this, or from us." He swallowed, wishing he could find words that sounded more certain than he felt. "I don't expect anything from you," he said carefully. "I don't even expect you to forgive me. But I do want to know him. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to help." She lifted her gaze to meet his then, and he knew she saw how raw he was, how much he meant it. For the first time since he'd arrived that morning, some of the tightness in her expression eased. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "We'll see," she said, her voice soft but firm. "For now, you can call. If you really mean to stay involved, he'll figure it out." He nodded too because anything more would have felt like asking for more than he deserved. He forced himself to step back as she turned to unlock the door. Liam glanced over his shoulder at him one last time, his small face serious in a way that made Andrew's heart feel too big for his chest. Then they disappeared into the building, and he was left alone on the sidewalk, feeling like the ground had shifted under his feet. He stood there for a long time, long after the door had closed, trying to absorb what had just happened. He had spent years telling himself he was strong because he didn't need anyone. But as he stood in front of that modest building, he realized he had never felt weaker or more afraid, because for the first time in his life, he wanted something he couldn't control. He wanted to be worthy of a place in that child's life. And he knew that if Rachel gave him even the smallest chance, he would spend the rest of his days proving he deserved it. The first time Andrew called, it took him almost an hour to work up the nerve. He had never felt so absurdly unsure of himself, not in any business negotiation, not even in the early days when he was building his first company from nothing. His hand hovered over his phone until he forced himself to dial the number Rachel had given him. Each ring sounded impossibly loud in his ear. When she finally picked up, he realized he had been holding his breath. Her voice was cautious but not cold, the quiet tone of someone who had learned to expect very little. He asked if it would be all right to see Liam again. She was silent for so long that he thought she might say no. Then, with a small sigh, she told him they would be in the park near their apartment around 11 the next morning. She didn't offer more than that, and he didn't ask. When he arrived the next day, he saw them before they saw him. Rachel was sitting on a bench near the playground, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. Liam was crouched beside a patch of grass, completely absorbed in picking up tiny stones and arranging them in a line. Andrew stood for a moment, studying the scene with a pang of longing so sharp it almost unbalanced him. He tried to imagine what it must have been like for Rachel to spend 3 years raising him alone. Every scraped knee and late-night fever. Every birthday he hadn't been there to celebrate. He wondered whether she had ever wished he would appear. Whether Liam had ever asked why he didn't have a father. When she finally looked up and saw him, she didn't smile but she didn't look away either. She lifted her hand in a brief, almost tentative wave. It was an invitation, but one that carried the weight of all the things she couldn't yet say. He walked across the grass feeling absurdly formal in his suit, painfully aware of how out of place he must look. When he stopped in front of them, Liam looked up from his stones. His small face was curious and wary all at once. Andrew crouched down so he wouldn't tower over him. "Hi, Liam," he said quietly. "Do you remember me?" Liam didn't answer. He just watched him in that solemn, searching way that made Andrew feel transparent. Rachel spoke softly, her voice pitched so Liam could hear but not feel pressured. "This is Andrew," she said. "He knew you when you were very little." The boy glanced at her, as though checking to see if she approved of this stranger. Then, with the small, decisive movements of a child who didn't overthink, he picked up one of the stones and held it out. Andrew took it carefully, feeling something in his chest loosen when Liam didn't pull his hand back right away. It was such a small gesture, but it felt enormous. For the next hour, they sat together in the grass while Liam showed him every little rock he had collected. Andrew listened to Rachel's quiet observations about which playground equipment Liam liked best, how he sometimes got shy around other kids, how he always wanted to take home something he found outside. He knew she was giving him these details because she understood he needed them. He also knew that sharing them cost her something, that she was trusting him a fraction more than she had the day before. When it was time to leave, Rachel rose and brushed grass from her jeans. Liam took her hand automatically. Andrew stood too, feeling like there were 1,000 things he wanted to say. He wanted to tell her he was sorry again. He wanted to promise he wouldn't fail them this time. But the words felt too big and too inadequate all at once. So instead, he simply said, "Thank you. For letting me come." Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was something like understanding there. "He'll need time," she said, her voice low. "I will too." "I know," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." As they walked away, Liam looked back over his shoulder. It was only a moment, but it felt like the smallest, most important step. When they disappeared around the corner, Andrew stood in the empty park feeling like something he had thought was permanently broken had shifted. Not healed, not yet. But no longer beyond repair. Over the next weeks, Andrew made visiting Liam part of his life in a way that felt more real than anything he had done in years. He adjusted his schedule so he could spend a few hours in the afternoons meeting them at the park or walking with them through the neighborhood. The first few times, he felt like an intruder. He tried to stay on the edges, careful not to overwhelm Liam or assume he had any right to step into the role of father just because biology said he could. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm of these visits began to change. Liam started to greet him with a shy wave instead of hiding behind Rachel's leg. He began to hold out a small hand for Andrew to take when they crossed the street, and each time Andrew felt that small warm weight, something settled in his chest that he hadn't even realized was missing. He began to learn Liam's little habits. How he liked to collect leaves and pretend they were treasure. How he always counted the dogs they passed on their walks. How he grew quiet and thoughtful right before he became tired, as if he were gathering the courage to admit he needed rest. Andrew treasured every detail. He kept them in his mind like precious evidence that this time he was showing up, that he was learning who his son was instead of imagining it from a distance. Rachel watched these changes with a kind of wary calm. She never discouraged Liam from reaching for Andrew's hand, but she never prompted him to do it either. She seemed determined that whatever bond grew between them would be real, not forced. He respected her for that, even though it meant progress was slow. He also knew it was the only way it could be. She needed to see that he was consistent, that this wasn't another grand gesture he would abandon when it became inconvenient. One afternoon, they stopped at a small cafe near the park. Rachel ordered tea, and Liam sat on the bench between them with a chocolate milk that left a faint mustache above his lip. Andrew found himself smiling at the sight. It struck him that he hadn't smiled like that, unguarded and simply happy, in years. He looked over and realized Rachel had noticed. Their eyes met, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was no accusation there. Only quiet acknowledgement that, despite everything, they were both doing the best they could. He wanted to tell her how sorry he was, not just for leaving but for the years he had spent convincing himself he was right. But he also knew that apologies, while necessary, would never be enough. So instead he listened as she told him about Liam's preschool, about how he liked painting and was learning to write his name. He nodded and asked questions, grateful for every piece of information she was willing to share. He realized that this was what love looked like in the aftermath of so much damage. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was slow, ordinary, built moment by moment in the small spaces of daily life. As the afternoon light faded and the cafe emptied, Liam began to grow drowsy, his head tipping against Rachel's arm. She shifted to lift him into her lap, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. The tenderness in her expression made something ache behind Andrew's ribs. He wondered how many nights she had sat exactly like this, steady and alone. He thought about how strong she had had to be, not because she wanted to but because there had been no other choice. Before they left, he offered to walk them home. Rachel hesitated, then nodded, and he felt a quiet swell of relief. They walked slowly down the block, Liam heavy with sleep on her shoulder. When they reached her building, she paused on the steps and turned to face him. For the first time, she looked almost unsure. "Do you want to carry him?" she asked. Her voice was so soft he nearly thought he had imagined it. He nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She shifted Liam gently into his arms, and the weight of his son against his chest was the most humbling thing he had ever felt. Liam stirred, his small hand catching in the fabric of Andrew's jacket. For a moment, Andrew closed his eyes and just let himself feel it. The warmth. The trust. The impossible relief of finally being here. When he opened his eyes, Rachel was watching him. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away. He thought she understood without needing him to explain that this was the first time he felt like he belonged anywhere. And as he carried Liam up the steps, he knew that no matter how long it took, he would keep coming back until he had proven that he wasn't going to leave again. The morning Rachel finally invited him inside felt almost unreal. It was a Saturday, gray and damp with the threat of rain, and he arrived early because he couldn't bear the thought of being even a minute late. He stood outside her building with a small bag of books and a stuffed bear Liam had pointed to in a shop window the week before. For a moment he hesitated on the steps, feeling the weight of everything this small moment represented. He had spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone, that distance and self-reliance were strengths, but as he stood there with his heart hammering, he knew this was the bravest thing he had ever done. When she opened the door, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep, but there was no hesitation in her voice when she stepped back to let him cross the threshold. It felt like crossing into a different life, one he didn't yet understand but wanted more than anything to be worthy of. The apartment was small and worn around the edges, with a few toys stacked neatly in bins along the wall and a row of children's books lined up on a low shelf. It smelled faintly of lavender and the warm sweetness of something baking, and he felt an ache he couldn't name as he imagined how many mornings she must have spent here alone, finding ways to make this space feel safe for their son. Liam was sitting cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by colored pencils. He looked up when Andrew stepped into the room and broke into a small, shy smile that made Andrew's throat tighten. He crouched down and held out the bear. Liam's eyes widened as he took it, his fingers brushing Andrew's hand with a soft, tentative trust that made him feel humbled to his bones. Rachel watched from the kitchen doorway. She didn't interrupt or comment, and he was grateful for her silence because he needed this moment to find its own shape. He sat on the floor beside Liam while the boy turned the bear over in his hands and eventually tucked it into the crook of his arm. They spent the next hour with Liam showing him every drawing, explaining in a quiet, serious voice what each picture meant. Andrew listened as though every word was the most important thing he had ever heard because, in a way he could never have explained before, it was. After a while, Rachel brought them mugs of tea and a plate of warm muffins. The three of them sat together in a circle on the rug, and it struck him that this was the first time he had ever shared something so ordinary and so profound. He remembered how he used to think intimacy meant grand gestures and expensive gifts, but now he saw it for what it really was, small, quiet rituals that made a life feel shared. Liam leaned against his side, growing drowsy, and Rachel rested her hand lightly on her son's back. Their fingers brushed for an instant, and neither of them moved away. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't even trust. But it was a beginning. A fragile agreement that maybe, if he was patient and steady and willing to earn every inch of progress, there could be something whole on the other side of all this regret. As the rain began to tap softly against the windows, he looked around the little room and felt something loosen in his chest. For so long he had believed that power meant never needing anyone, never letting them see where he was afraid. But sitting there on the rug with Liam curled against him and Rachel watching with her guarded, hopeful eyes, he realized that he had never known real strength until he chose to stay. When it was time to leave, Liam stirred and wrapped his arms around Andrew's neck in a clumsy hug that nearly unraveled him. He held on as gently as he could, closing his eyes against the hot sting of tears he didn't want to embarrass the boy by shedding. When he finally stood and handed Liam back to Rachel, her eyes met his, and for the first time, he thought he saw something that looked like possibility. He didn't ask if he could come again because he didn't want to make her feel pressured. But as he turned to go, she surprised him by speaking quietly. "You can come tomorrow if you'd like." He nodded, unable to find words that felt big enough for what that meant. As he stepped back out into the soft drizzle, he felt as if he were carrying something precious in his chest. He knew there were still countless mistakes to mend, years he could never reclaim, and fears that would surface again and again. But he also knew that for the first time, he wouldn't run. He would be there, every day, proving that he was no longer the man who walked away. And for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. I think this ending is powerful exactly because it doesn't try to pretend that love fixes everything overnight. Instead, it shows how true redemption happens in small, repeated choices, showing up, listening without defensiveness, taking responsibility without expecting immediate forgiveness. What moved me most is how Andrew's transformation isn't about grand declarations but about simple, consistent presence. He finally understands that trust is built in quiet, ordinary moments, sitting on the floor coloring, carrying a sleepy child, respecting boundaries he once ignored. That's a humbling realization for someone who spent his life believing success was measured by control and status. I appreciate that the story leaves space for uncertainty. Rachel doesn't instantly forgive him, and she shouldn't. The ending honors her strength and Liam's need for stability while still allowing hope to grow in a believable way. For me, the most beautiful part is that Andrew stops trying to prove he's right or worthy and instead commits to simply being there, without guarantees. That is what makes this ending feel real and uplifting. It's not a neat resolution but the first genuine step toward healing, which is so much more meaningful than any fairy tale reconciliation.